It was 4 AM on Christmas morning 1995, and an 11-year-old retro mule had just eviscerated 2 sugar pigs, half a Cadbury's chocolate selection box, and a sack of chocolate coins, and now stood on the verge of a sugar-induced coma.
Tis the season, watch out, look around, something's coming to town.
Generally speaking, me and my older brother would wake up at about 2 AM on Christmas morning, open our Star Wars or Garfield annuals, ingest potentially fatal quantities of sugar, and watch some of the bizarre, obscure, and fascinating shite they used to show on late night TV in the UK back in those days. Terrifying anthropomorphic rabbit movie Mr. Horatio Nibbles springs to mind.
Oh, Mr. Nibbles, you gave him such a fright.
As does a grotesque 70s version of Pippi Longstocking, and I'm still traumatised to this day by the sight of Boromir getting nailed to a tree in Ralph Bakshi's awesome but petrifying version of Lord of the Rings. I was always super excited at Christmas, but this particular one was special. I was about to unwrap a turbocharged 150-pound black plastic mushroom known as the Sega 32X, and a copy of arguably its greatest game, Virtua Fighter.
Alright, baby.
I'd played the game once or twice in arcades since its 1993 release, and was amazed, excited, and entranced. Virtua Fighter was the cutting-edge toast of the town in the mid-90s, and the thought of having access to this super-powered candy-coloured kung fu wonderland in my own little bedroom made me practically foam at the mouth. The very recently released Sega Saturn had its own version of Virtua Fighter 2, of course, and it ought to have been closer to the original arcade version.
It's how you play the game.
But the Saturn was expensive as balls in 1995, and amazingly, the Magic Mushrooms version actually turned out to be the better game in many ways. The 32X captured the gameplay and the essence of Virtua Fighter almost perfectly, and I spent Christmas Day in Cloud Cuckoo Land. My Micro Machine Supervan City barely got a look in. I loved my 32X, despite being one of 2 people in the UK to actually own one. In fact, I still own the old bird, seen here attached to this preposterously unwieldy tower of power, and I still love to get lost in a good session of Virtua Fighter, but at least my eating habits have improved since those days. Anyhow, that's just my personal story. To take a proper look at Virtua Fighter, we have to go right back to the start. It was 1992, and Sega was seemingly everywhere.
Now, sir.
Give me the Cyber Razor Cut.
A Cyber Razor Cut.
There are over 100 Mega Drive games. They get faster, they get harder. What are you going to do to keep up?
Next.
You mean it works?
To be this good takes saying it.
As we were all busy being bowled over by the blistering speed of Sonic 2 on our Mega Drive/Genesises, this was making its debut in arcades. Behind the scenes, Sega was ramping up its arcade hardware to quite preposterous levels, locked deep in a technological arms race with its competitors, chiefly Namco. In the 1990s, these companies fought tooth and nail to produce the most astonishing arcade experiences possible.
Did you press emergency button? I wiped it, I think, yeah. I think I'm going to be sick.
The wow factor of arcade games was of prime importance in those days, stopping arcade goers dead in their tracks with their gigantic cabinets and eye-popping visuals. But it's important to remember that the gameplay, at least in games from the likes of Namco and Sega, was also top-notch. These titles were not only an incredible spectacle to behold, they were also, for the most part, expertly crafted video games. This was a time when arcade hardware was far beyond what could be experienced at home, unless you count the expensive and esoteric Neo Geo, I suppose. And this is where the arcade got a lot of its mystique and sense of excitement from. If you wanted to experience the most spectacular, cutting-edge graphics and experience all the full-fat arcade features like force feedback, rotating cabinets, gigantic displays and God knows what else, you had to get up off your arse and get down to the arcade. Coin-op games represented the absolute bleeding edge of tech. Never intended as consumer products, the developers were free to throw everything but the kitchen sink at them. And they did exactly that. To put it into a little bit of perspective, even the Sega Saturn and 32X struggled somewhat to reproduce the raw performance of the Sega Y board, for example, home to incredible sprite scaling based games like Galaxy Force 2, G-Lock and Rail Chase. That's despite being released more than 5 years later. Following on from these spectacular sprite scaling games, in the early 90s, Sega pushed into real-time 3D graphics in a big way. The head of Sega's AM2 division, Yu Suzuki, gives a helpful overview of this era. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. I was working on 3D for my graduation thesis at university, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, America's military simulation industry was placed in the private sector, so the timing was perfect. This accelerated the era of 3D. Video games evolved together with advances in semiconductors. The video game market started with Atari's hit Pong. Processing power improved rapidly, polygon graphics were used, and we've reached where we are today. It just so happened that a lot of things luckily came together. There have been numerous earlier examples of polygon-based games, but 1992's Virtua Racing raised things to a level of sophistication not yet seen. It was an incredible sight back in the day to see an entire wall of the deluxe models of these things all linked together in the arcade. This was multiplayer gaming on a scale not yet seen, and the 3D was absolutely eye-popping. Things that are taken for granted these days, like selectable camera views for example, were very novel features at the time, as illustrated by the cabinet's 4 illuminated view buttons. And aside from all this cutting-edge hardware and spectacle, the gameplay was absolutely fantastic too. The brains and brawn powering this fantastic cutting-edge racing experience was the Sega Model 1 arcade hardware. This is my own Sega Model 1 board that I've owned for a few years now. It's hooked up via an intricate wiring job done by the dude I bought it from, not me, to a standard jammer harness that then runs into a super gun, and then I have to upscale the non-standard 24 kHz medium resolution of 384p up to something my TV can deal with. In my case, I use an Extron 300A, but other scalers are available of course. But I digress. The Sega Model 1, then known as the CG board, was the successor to the Sega System 32, released in 1990. While earlier Sega hardware was somewhat capable of handling 3D polygons, the Mega Drive for example, released in 1988, the Model 1 was Sega's first hardware specifically designed for 3D polygon graphics. The Model 1 board took 3 years to develop, with the Yu Suzuki's Sega AM2 team involved in its development from the drawing board. It was intended to compete with Namco's System 21. Namco was then the market leader in polygonal 3D video games, with titles such as Galaxian and Starblade taking arcades by storm. The Model 1 was a very powerful piece of kit. Fujitsu was heavily involved with its development, providing the DSP coprocessors, which were modified by Sega with custom microcode for hardware, texture and lighting capabilities. In a side note, hardware, texture and lighting wouldn't appear on consumer home systems for several years. Fujitsu provided several other components, including the tarmac generator chip, the DMA controllers, and several memory chips. To put it bluntly, this thing was an absolute bulldozer for its day. It was a significant jump up from even the System 21, but the Model 1 hardware was expensive to produce. Only a few games were developed for the platform, but what incredible games they were. Former Sega AM2 staff member Daiichi Katagiri offers some interesting perspectives on the genesis of Virtua Fighter. There were a lot of other projects being researched when Virtua Fighter was being worked on. Like, what would Virtua Racing be like with 3 screens? Or what would Virtua Racing be like if you were flying? There was a programmer who was working on a project where he wanted to see what it would be like to put the pit crew from Virtua Racing into a fighting game. He joined the company around the same time I did, and we were friends, so I tested that game out for him, and before I knew it, I was working with Yu Suzuki. Suzuki himself sheds further light. The roots of Virtua Fighter actually lie in the pit crew of Virtua Racing. The car models were quite simple, with very few moving parts. When likened to the joints of an animal, you could say that they really only had one kind of joint that we needed to work with. Virtua Racing was a 3D game, and looking ahead to my next 3D project, I really wanted to do a game that required simultaneous multiple joint movements. The hardware we had at the time wasn't powerful enough for what I originally had in mind, but after finding that I could simulate basic human movement with 30 to 32 joints, we created Virtua Racing's pit crew as test subjects. Street Fighter 2 was an absolute monster at that time, lighting up arcades and home consoles. A huge number of imitators followed. Sega themselves had no direct equivalent, and Yu Suzuki and his team had something very special planned. Suzuki explains, "Following the success of Street Fighter 2, over 600 titles were released, hoping to ride the genre's newfound popularity, but none could surpass the benchmark Street Fighter 2 had set. As a result, our idea of creating a 3D fighting game faced a lot of heated opposition initially. At the very least, I was certain I'd be able to recover the cost of development, and I certainly remember begging the top brass to give my project a chance. 3D graphics in games were very primitive. You could only make models from triangles, which didn't even have textures," he added. "There wasn't the opportunity to make graphics that were really beautiful, and because of that, I decided to spend all my efforts to make character movements correct and realistic. Yes, Street Fighter had very nice sprites, but we had the advantage of very smooth movements. Back then, the only things that could perform that quickly were nuclear reactors that needed to shut down in 1/1000th of a second, rockets whose angle of entry into the atmosphere mustn't be out by even a fraction of a degree, and Virtua Fighter. Behind the scenes, we were working away with craftsmanship equivalent to inscribing 100 words on a single grain of rice. That's how proud we were of what we were achieving." Virtua Fighter was a genuinely groundbreaking game on several fronts. Up until that time, fighting games such as the Street Fighter series were designed and rendered on sprite-based 2D graphics hardware. Both the character animation and background scenery were composed of 2D sprites and tile maps, often employing multiple layers to produce a parallax scrolling effect that added the impression of depth. Virtua Fighter dispensed with the 2D graphics, except for the backgrounds, replacing them with flat-shaded triangles rendered in real time, allowing for effects and technologies that were impossible in sprite-based fighters, such as a dynamic camera that could zoom, pan, and swoop dramatically around the arena.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
also introduced a 3D physics engine with realistic movement, where if a character was hit in the head, for example, they fell backwards in a relatively realistic manner, and if they were hit with a spin kick, they would spin away before hitting the ground. Players could feel the impact when a character hit the ground, and found that the character didn't weightlessly ping back up to their feet, as in many a traditional 2D fighting game. This game had a more realistic take, attempting to somewhat realistically represent actual martial arts disciplines. Suzuki elaborates on this point. They, the player, want realism. They want a simulation, but they want it to be entertainment first and foremost. Since everyone pays the same amount of money to play, I want everyone to have a good time. Beyond its technical achievements, a great deal of attention was paid to the gameplay mechanics themselves. Daichi Katagiri explains, "When we talked about how a jumping attack had to be able to beat a crouching guard, Yu Suzuki said, a kick would hit a crouching opponent in actual martial arts, right? And then one day he came to me and asked me to come play some matches while it was still in development. He used Sarah and I used an Arab character that was in the development build called Siba. I was thinking, you can't break crouching guard in this game, you're basically invincible while crouching. But he kept using Sarah's elbow technique called double joint butt and beat the crap out of me with it. So then when I said, hold on a second, what's up with this move? Why am I taking damage from it while I'm crouching guarding? He told me, I was thinking maybe knees and front kicks should be able to hit a crouching opponent, and I definitely agreed. And that's where the idea of mid-attacks came about. It ended up being a genius idea. Making new things is what he does. He also said that it was weird to not be able to attack opponents when they were down, so he came up with down attacks. I was really impressed by the idea of there being an attack and defense while downed. Exactly like real martial arts. The characters in Virtua Fighter have sometimes been labelled bland and boring in comparison to other fighting games such as Tekken and Street Fighter 2. Personally, I couldn't agree less. For starters, in keeping with Virtua Fighter's somewhat realistic approach, its characters are more grounded in nature. You won't find any electricity-wielding Brazilian mutants in here, and there are definitely no red-eyed cyborgs or genetically engineered kangaroos. The characters you do get are more physical representations of the fighting styles themselves, rather than the other way around. In my humble opinion, that's the right way to go about designing a game. That being said, I also find the character models themselves beautiful to look at. Though in this first game at least, they might look like they've been assembled from a load of empty cereal boxes, I love their super clean, candy coloured aesthetic, and I find them beautifully pure and abstract. I really admire how the artist found a way to communicate these archetypal fighting styles so effectively with so few polygons and no texture mapping whatsoever. You can pretty much tell just by looking at them what their fighting style is going to be, from ill-tempered, snub-nosed blue ninja man Kage to hulking, simple-minded pineapple head Jeffrey. I think LEGO Star Wars is a slightly weird but fair analogy. The beauty and appeal of a great LEGO set is that it distills and captures the essence of a scene, without including a great amount of detail. When the details of a highly realistic set aren't quite right, a strange kind of cognitive dissonance can occur, and they can be left trudging around somewhere lost in the uncanny valley. Good LEGO sets don't strive for realism, they strive to capture the idea of Star Wars, simple, pure, and abstract. To quote something that Yoda never actually said, "More important than the manifestation, the essence is." That's the art of caricature, and it's why a well-designed Star Wars LEGO set can often feel truer to the movies than much more realistic representations. Virtua Fighter attempts to capture the idea and the essence of martial arts combat. Not extreme detail or hyperrealism, and including hyperbolic characters or overly fanciful moves would only serve to cloud that vision. In terms of the game's story, I'm of the opinion that less is more when it comes to these things. With the home versions at least, you do get a little write-up of the characters' backgrounds and of the tournament itself, but it's really just a hazy outline, and in my opinion, that's enough. Stories in fighting games are not really necessary, and in fact in some games they can get in the way. I used to gaze upon this game as a kid and wonder what the characters' backstories were. In my opinion, it's one of those things that's probably best left to the imagination. That being said, there actually is quite a bit of backstory to the characters if you know where to look, and I'd highly recommend Virtua Bros Virtua Fighter lore videos if you're interested. The music of Virtua Fighter is often somewhat overlooked, but it's undoubtedly a huge part of this game's appeal. The Sega Model 1 utilised a Toshiba sound CPU at 12 MHz, 2 Sega custom multi-PCM chips, and a Yamaha YM3834 used as a sound timer. This allowed for 28 PCM channels per chip, one for music, one for sound effects, and 56 PCM channels in total. In Earth language, this means that it was a bit of a beast. You can see here that the Model 1 had an entire separate board dedicated purely to sound. It's important to note that this game didn't use pre-recorded music. The sounds are generated by the hardware itself, played live, if you will. This game sounded phenomenal for its day, vastly more sophisticated than the PCM or FM that you might have heard on a home console at the time. The tunes themselves were composed by a number of individuals, including the living legend that is Takanobu Mitsuyoshi, and Takeyuki Nakamura. The music has precisely the right amount of melody, scope, attack, and cheese.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
Stage music in particular instantly transports me to Cloud Cuckoo Blue Skies Virtua Fighter land the second I hear it. And really, all the music in the game is awesome, to be honest, and also deceptively complex. I have an almost complete lack of musical knowledge, but just listen to the intricate melody here. It really is inspired stuff. I first experienced this game while on holiday in North Wales as a little boy, in a somewhat sleepy coastal town called Llandudno. They had a big arcade at the end of the pier, and a gigantic Super Megalo machine set up with an enormous rear projection screen and a huge control panel with a sit-down configuration. It was a thrilling experience seeing and playing Virtua Fighter for the first time. The 3D itself was far beyond anything I'd played before, but it was perhaps the animation that really stood out. I would argue that although its sequels improved upon the original game's formula by almost every conceivable metric, there does remain a lifelike realism and weight to the animations in this first game that was never quite bettered, in my opinion. The sense of crunching, hulking weight as Jeffrey smashes his knee into an opponent's face made me, my brother, and my dad genuinely wince at the time. As an audience, we were accustomed to the almost pinball-esque action of contemporary 2D fighters, and it really was a sight to behold. The game was commercially successful in Japan. After a somewhat slow start, it became one of Japan's highest-grossing arcade games of all time. Virtua Fighter was a hot property, and in my mind at least, it, along with its sequels, became emblematic of this era of unobtainable, super-powered arcade hardware. The prospect of getting a somewhat comparable version for home consoles was a tantalizing yet seemingly unlikely prospect in 1993. Certainly the Sega Mega Drive was not capable of doing it any real justice. However, Sega showcased its new Sega Saturn console at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1994, and suddenly it seemed like a realistic prospect.
News. あのバーチャファイターを完全移植。さらにセガサターンだけのオリジナル機能も楽しめる。10年早いんだよ。誕生バーチャファイターセガサターンから。
Similarly, Sega's 32X, an add-on for the Mega Drive, was unveiled at June 1994's Consumer Electronics Show. It contained two 32-bit central processing units and a 3D graphics processor. It too proved capable of somewhat complex 3D polygon-based graphics, and the stage was set for home ports of Virtua Fighter. And so, a bit like Inception, we've come full circle. For me personally, it's the measured yet intense and compulsive scissors-paper-stone mechanics, the sense of impact and heft in the animations, the super clean, brightly coloured aesthetic, and the phenomenally optimistic, melodic music that makes this game so special. There is a purity at the heart of this game. It is at once stripped down in terms of its aesthetics and its 3-button gameplay, yet for those happy to spend time exploring its mechanics, it's also incredibly deep and intricate. It requires a mastery of its systems to play at a competitive level, yet newcomers can instantly attach themselves to the core guard punch kick system and have a damn good time, and therein lies its genius. The 3D itself was quickly superseded by that of its own texture-mapped 60 frames per second sequel, but looking at the original game today, I still see a truly beautiful game. Its somewhat unintentionally stylized visuals are simply timeless, the relative lack of detail drawing attention to the quality of the animations and to the game mechanics themselves. This was the genesis not only of arguably the greatest fighting series of all time, but also of all modern 3D beat-em-ups. In a somewhat cruel irony, it's been said that once Sony caught a glimpse of the amazing 3D graphics on Virtua Fighter, the direction of its PlayStation console was set. Sony was going to put all its chips down on 3D, and it was about to win big, at the expense of Sega. Nevertheless, this is a landmark game, and thankfully this wonderful series is still with us today, 30 odd years later. I for one am massively looking forward to Virtua Fighter 6. There's a distinct aesthetic to many of these 90s, early 2000s Sega games that has, over the years and decades, seared itself into my brain. Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, Sega Rally, Virtua Cop, and even games like Nights into Dreams, and arguably the Shenmue series, almost seem to exist in the same extended universe. A beautifully abstract realm of simple polygonal forms, swaying palm trees, joyous primary colours, and soaring blue skies. As I get older, wiser, and slightly fatter. For better or worse, I don't think I'll ever get tired of getting swept away from time to time by the irresistible positivity of these exquisitely abstract, sun-drenched playgrounds. Let's go away indeed. Next time, I'll be looking at the technological behemoth that is Virtua Fighter 2, but until then, this is all I have to say.